Hello, SPED 431. Here are your lecture notes and PowerPoint for week 12. Make sure that you view these on your own. Pay special attention to the items that are starred as they will be part of your check for understanding for next week. Our lesson outcomes for the week: identify and differentiate between the 5 reinforcement-based strategies for behavior reduction, explain the problems associated with extinction, identify types of behavior reduction strategies associated with the removal of desired stimuli, and identify types of behavior reduction strategies associated with the presentation of aversive stimuli. So chapter 9, arranging consequences that decrease behavior. When I started planning for this chapter, the whole first paragraph I thought really stood out to me as um, kind of an aha and kind of a good summary about this chapter. So I wanted to put this all into words here because I think it's important not to leave any of it out. So the first paragraph in chapter 9, which again is kind of the precursor to this entire chapter, says, when teachers complain about a student's misbehavior, other teachers usually offer sympathy and advice. Too often their suggestions emphasize punishment, by which they mean applying an aversive stimulus following the inappropriate behavior. For example, a rap on the back of the head, hopefully not doing that in school, a reading of the riot act, or a prolonged visit to the principal, where the student will learn how the school is run. Using punishment can become a reflex because it often simply and immediately stops the behavior. It works. Using punishment negatively reinforces teachers. Unfortunately, that reinforcement may make teachers lose sight of the side effects or reactions that may accompany the use of punishment that will have the same effect of reducing the occurrence of inappropriate and challenging behavior. These alternatives are presented as a sequenced hierarchy. The sequence moves from the most positive approach for behavior reduction, those that use reinforcement strategies, to the most aversive approaches. Although the use of aversive consequences has a conceptual place in the hierarchy, due to ethical and professional considerations and awareness of the undesirable effects that aversive stimuli produce, these approaches are rarely, if ever, appropriate in the school setting. So again, I just kind of want to point that out. We are going to talk about some things in this chapter, in this lecture, that you should not do in school. However, when we talk about behavior, they do have a place in that hierarchy, but just understand that some of the things we will talk about this week, you should never do in school, and I'll be clear to point those out. So if you remember back in chapter 8, we talked about consequences that increase behavior. This whole chapter is about consequences that decrease behavior. Certain principles should help us guide the selection of a procedure for behavior reduction. The authors offer a hierarchy in which we should follow, starting with the least intrusive alternative and then moving up levels if needed. So, for example, you would not use a level 4 procedure before trying to exhaust levels 1 through 3. It's kind of like least restrictive environment. So, if you think about putting a student in their least restrictive environment, you wouldn't take a student who you are just identifying for some behavior concerns and put them into a self-contained behavior room before putting other interventions and trying other less intrusive strategies or less restrictive settings before you move to that route. So same thing with choosing different consequences and different levels of reinforcer. So level 1 reinforcement-based procedures are research proven to be highly successful. That's why we have things like PBIS. That's why there's so much talk about positive intervention. It has been proven successful for a variety of students. On the bottom of page 225, you'll notice that figure 9.1 shows the procedural alternatives for behavior reduction. So there's a nice chart there of the hierarchy if you'd like to check that out. The authors also take great notice about, as much as it is important to follow the hierarchy, teaching the replacement behavior which meets the same function of the behavior of concern is just as important. So I know that's something that we've talked about several times since we started talking about function of behavior. So again, this just kind of reinforces our thoughts. We have to make sure that whatever replacement or alternative behavior we put in place is meeting the same function. Otherwise, we're likely not going to achieve the outcomes. So there are some requirements that must be met in implementing procedures for behavior reduction. So we always want to make sure that as we're moving along the hierarchy or changing the different consequences or reinforcers, that that information that we're using to drive those decisions is data-based and data-driven. We don't just wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'm going to change this kid's plan. We're using data to help drive those decisions. Also, not mentioned in the book, but we'll talk a little bit about this week in class. We also want to make sure that we're not changing too many elements of the plan at once. So let's say we're starting off with a level 1 reinforcer to try and decrease the student's inappropriate behavior. And we decide that that is not working well because data is telling us that it's not working well. We would only want to make one change at a time. So after that data tells us that this reinforcement is not working the way we wanted it to, we may only change the frequency of the reinforcement. We may change the type of reinforcement, but we wouldn't change both of those things at once. The reason we wouldn't change them both at once is because then, if the intervention begins to work, or if it still is not working after we collect some data, it's hard for us to be able to know which factor is contributing to that. So we want to make sure that when we're making changes to a plan, we make small changes and collect data on those changes so that we can then make another change if needed. The other important requirement is that teachers must consult with administration, parents, other members of the behavior or IEP team, basically anybody that's a part of that before movement to address appropriate changes to the plan. So because the FBA and the behavior intervention plan are both documents of the IEP and are both legal binding documents and follow the same procedural rights. They have the same procedural rights that the other documents in the IEP do and are protected. The IEP team has to come to a conclusion that yes, this is the next best step. Now that doesn't mean that you have to have a formal sit-down IEP meeting every time that a change needs to be made, but everyone needs to be informed and everyone needs to be in agreement and on the same page. The authors talk about 4 levels of options for reducing undesired behavior. We're going to go through each of these levels in detail, but make sure that you know the levels. So level 1 is that positive reinforcement approach to reducing undesired behavior. Level 2 are extinction procedures. Level 3, we're talking about punishing consequences when we talk about level 3 and level 4. The difference is level 3 has some of those lower level punishing consequences. Once you get to level 4, then we talk more about what we really think of as punishing consequences. Most of the stuff in level 4 you will not want to do in a school. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so when we talk about level 1 reinforcement-based strategies, the author offers 5 different types. And I can honestly say that I have never sat in a meeting and said, we're using DRL or differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior. However, they're terms that are great to know because even though we don't necessarily think of them in terms, it does offer us different ways to provide reinforcement strategies when we're kind of coming to a roadblock. We may put a reinforcement strategy in place, not realizing what it's actually called. But if I put in a differential reinforcement of other behaviors, so kind of that zero occurrence behavior, and that is not working, it doesn't mean that the reinforcement system itself is not working or that the reinforcement itself is not working. Maybe it's how I deliver that reinforcement, and I can move within levels of this level 1 or move within systems of this level 1 to help build a different reinforcement system or help make a change that'll help that student. So the first one, differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior, or DRL. It's a specific schedule of reinforcers used to decrease the rate of behaviors that are tolerable in low rates, but not high rates, through gradual reduction. So the goal here is we want to gradually reduce the behavior. An example of this, the author gives several good examples. One that stuck out to me was the difference in a student contributing to a discussion in class, which is something we want them to do. We want them to participate. We want them to contribute versus dominating a discussion. So if a student is asking all of the questions, providing all of the comments, blurting out to share, if they're oversharing and over discussing and over contributing in class, then that would be a behavior that we would want to reduce. We don't want them to stop participating. We just need them to keep it to a manageable level. On page 228 of your book, it talks about the scheduling use of DRL. So the authors note that baseline must be used to record a baseline to determine the average number of responses for a full session. Reasonably spaced criteria should be established when using successfully decreasing DRL. So we want to kind of ratio that out and say, okay, here, let's talk about a student who's over contributing in class. If that student is blurting out, asking questions, contributing 28 times in a half an hour class period, we may want to reduce that down to 20 to begin with. Maybe by the next week, we want to reduce that down to 14 or 15, whatever that is, but that we set some spaced criteria. And then the decision needs to be made by the teacher whether or not to provide them feedback to the student concerning the number of responses during that session. That just kind of depends on the age and level of your student. Not something you would probably discuss with a kindergartner or first grader. They're not going to understand it. Or a student who has some cognitive impairments, they may not understand that. So you just have to know your learner. The second one, differential reinforcement of other behaviors, so DRO. It's similar to DRL, but instead of gradually decreasing, we want that to drop down to 0 occurrences. On page 229, they offer several different administrative variations. When we're using DRO, we want to make sure that reinforcement is contingent on the non-occurrence of behavior. So they only get reinforced if they do not exhibit that behavior at all. So if we're thinking about interval recording, it's kind of like full interval recording. They either show it or they don't, and they could exhibit it once, or they could exhibit it 100 times, but if they're showing the undesired behavior, there's no reinforcement. It's contingent upon that zero occurrence. Reinforcement is also contingent on the non-occurrence of behavior within a time period that has been divided into small intervals. So making sure that, especially when we start out with reinforcing that behavior, that we're not expecting the student to carry out that zero occurrence behavior the entire day or the entire time. Again, you have to know your learner. Depending on where your baseline is at, depending on what you're starting out with, if we go to a blurting situation, if a student is blurting 50 times in a 30-minute class period, it's unrealistic to think that they will immediately drop to 0, and that's the only way they're going to get reinforced. So you have to know the behavior, you have to know the student that you're working with. The last one is that DRO can also be used with permanent product data. So think about work. The author gives an example of the teacher drawing a smiley face on every paper that does not contain doodles. So if a student's used to doodling or drawing all over their paper, making it a mess, and you want that zero occurrence behavior, that DRO reinforcement system in place, every time the student hands in a paper that doesn't have doodles or drawing on it, putting a smiley face on there is a reinforcement of a permanent product. All right, the third one is differential reinforcement of alternative behavior and incompatible behavior or DRA. So this is where inappropriate behavior is replaced by more acceptable behavior, usually based on the functional compatibility. So again, we always go back to that teaching the alternative behavior. We want that to have the same function. When we look at DRI, or the differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, this is where we reinforce behavior that is topographically, I can't even say that word, topographically, let's try that, incompatible with the behavior targeted for reduction. So for example, if we look at out-of-seat behavior versus in-seat behavior, a student cannot do both at the same time. You can't be out of your seat and in your seat at the same time. However, with DRA, when you're talking about alternative behavior and incompatible behavior, that DRA, you can actually, this is where you could actually see two behaviors that what you could see possibly the inappropriate and the appropriate behaviors at once. With DRI, you're not going to, because they physically cannot be the same. So when we talk about that DRI, one of two procedures has to be implemented. You have to make sure that the inappropriate behavior is either ignored or the inappropriate behavior is redirected. On page 232 of your text, it talks about functional equivalency training. Training like this is where we take that training and we look at it in a long-term view of behavior change versus a short-term crisis management. So when we're talking about putting alternative behaviors into place, and we want to put in place that functional equivalency training, again, to make sure that this is long-term and it's not something that's just short-term to, per se, put out the fire that we're dealing with. We want to make sure that the alternative behavior serves the same function. We want to make sure that the student, parent, the general public, administrators, community, all view the alternative behavior as a more appropriate choice than the inappropriate behavior that they're exhibiting. The alternative behavior requires equal or less physical effort and complexity. So we don't want to put in place an alternative behavior and expect them to carry it out long term that is going to be very difficult for them to do. We want to make sure that it's equal to the behavior that they're exhibiting in the inappropriate way. The alternative behavior results in the same type, quantity, or intensity of reinforcer. Otherwise, students will learn very quickly that it's not worth their time and not worth their payoff, and they can revert back to the inappropriate behaviors. The alternative behavior is reinforced on the same schedule. There is no greater delay between performance of the alternative behavior than there is to the performance of the original behavior. And the last thing we want to make sure is that eventually the alternative behavior can be maintained by natural reinforcers. So we always want to keep that in the back of our mind. The last one is non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR. Non-contingent reinforcement refers to receiving reinforcement at pre-selected intervals rather than when the student performs the appropriate behavior. We do that for the student to learn to disassociate behavior with reinforcement to result in a behavior decrease. So again, that kind of goes back to that natural reinforcement piece. Level 2 refers to extinction. Extinction is when we reduce behavior by withholding or terminating the positive reinforcer that maintains an inappropriate target behavior, or the abrupt withdrawal results in the extinction of behavior. Teachers most often use this in a classroom to decrease behaviors that are maintained by teacher attention. So a student who is constantly blurting out or getting out of their seat to get the teacher's attention, when a teacher starts to ignore or not respond to those behaviors, that is a common example of extinction used in a classroom. When we stop giving the student the attention they want, most likely the behaviors will decrease. Often this is difficult for teachers to determine when they are accidentally reinforcing that inappropriate behavior. Sometimes they think that they're purposefully ignoring a student, but it may be best to have an outside source observe. If you've identified that a student is attention seeking and that they are behaving in such a way to get your attention that is maintaining the behavior, and you feel like you're doing a really good job of ignoring them, and things are still not getting better, it may be best just to have another teacher, someone else come in and observe. And sometimes an outsider's view can provide um, some different insight to what's actually going on in the classroom. So, the problem with extinction, or one of the downfalls with extinction, is that it may take a considerable amount of time to see a decrease. A student who is attention seeking is not going to pick up on right away that you're ignoring them to try and get them to stop the behavior that they're exhibiting. It's often seen that the behavior will get a little worse before it gets better. When the student realizes that their prior tactics are not working to get teacher attention, they may up their game a little bit until they realize that nothing that they do is going to get them that attention. So when we're in that extinction period, we always see that things do get a little worse before they get better. So one thing that's important as a teacher is making sure that you're controlling your attention. And this kind of goes back to the last slide where we talked about, it might be a good idea to have someone else come in and observe. Just because we're not offering a student verbal or physical feedback when they're exhibiting inappropriate behavior does not mean that we don't have some nonverbal indicators that show that we're aware of the inappropriate behavior. So again, having someone else come in and watch, that's something that we're not always aware of. I love that the author offers these following suggestions to help. So when you're purposefully trying to ignore a student and you're worried about whether or not you're, maybe making a face when they do it, maybe your body's tensing up and they can see that it's annoying or frustrating you. Some of these kind of made me giggle, but to help with that planned ignoring, become involved with another student, particularly another student who is showing the appropriate behavior. Pretend that you're busy, write something, read something, do something to make yourself look busy. Recite epic poetry subvocally. That one kind of made me giggle. Carry a worry rock or bead, something to keep your hands busy. And if all else fails, number 5, stand outside the room and kick the wall for a minute. Whatever you have to do, some of these attention seeking behaviors can be really annoying, but the more we play into it, whether it's verbally, physically, non verbally, students are smart and they're going to pick up on that. And if they are doing it to get your attention, to get your goat, um, and they can see that it's working, it will continue. So a few other things to watch out for with extinction. We can see what's called extinction-induced aggression. Kind of like I talked about a few minutes ago, the student may actually ramp up their behavior so that it's harder to ignore. If at first the student is just blurting and all of a sudden they're not getting the attention from blurting, they may move to a behavior that looks a little more severe to try and get your attention. Kids who are attention seeking and are truly after that payoff, will figure out that there are certain behaviors that are harder for teachers to ignore, like physical aggression, swearing, things like that we can't just allow to go on in a classroom without doing anything. So just watch for that. Also, spontaneous recovery may occur. That's when the behavior, after it's hit an extinction period, will just temporarily reappear. And really, that's just a student testing a teacher. They've figured out that they're not going to gain the attention by showing the inappropriate behavior. Don't be surprised if it shows up again just out of the blue. It's a test. They're testing to see if you'll stick to your guns. Also, watch out for imitation by others. So, if some students see that a student is getting away with, let's go back to blurting out over and over again, and they're not getting in trouble and they're not being called out for it, other students may attempt the same. It's also equally important to make sure that these are skills that can be generalized and that everybody that has um, everybody that works with this student or everyone that has a share in responsibility with this student is on the same page. If the behavior is only in extinction in your classroom, but they go to, let's say, their specials classroom, they go to music, PE, art, whatever, and the behavior is allowed to happen and the student is still getting attention for it, it's going to be harder for that extinction period to take place if a student doesn't understand the difference in different settings. So you want to make sure that your whole team is on the same page and that everyone is using the same response strategies. There are 6 considerations on page 238 to go through before deciding to use an extinction. And those talk about whether the behavior can be tolerated temporarily. So if it's aggressive, then obviously that's not something that we can ignore. We have to make sure that it's a behavior that can be tolerated and ignored. Can an increase in behavior be tolerated? So what might that look like when the student ramps it up? Is the behavior likely to be imitated? So again, will peers pick up on that? Are the reinforcers known? Can reinforcement be withheld? And has alternative behavior been identified for reinforcement? So all things to consider. It also talks about, and we're not going to go into it in great detail, but it does talk about sensory extinction. Sensory extinction is often misunderstood, that maybe the student has a function of behavior that is attention based, maybe they're trying to get a teacher's attention, maybe it's escape based. We have to remember about sensory that sometimes sensory functions just happen because it feels good or it feels right. So we have to be able to identify when there are sensory reinforcers, and we have to be able to replace that same sensory need with something that is more acceptable. So just keep that in mind as well. We then go on to talk about punishment. So a punisher is a consequent stimulus that decreases the future rate or probability of occurrence of behavior, is administered contingently on the production of undesired behavior, and is administered immediately following the production of undesired behavior. Punishment and punisher, both words, can be identified only by its effect on the behavior. So for an example, if I send a student to the principal's office as a punishment, but that student's function of behavior is to get attention, and they go to the principal's office and the secretary talks to them, and they get to talk to everyone that walks by the office, that is not a punishment. That is not something that will decrease the behavior. And that is that's number one of our definition there. That is something that will likely increase the behavior because we're kind of fueling that function unintentionally. Also, the book gives several other examples. They talk about, a father spanking their son because they're throwing toys. If it doesn't stop the child from throwing toys, then the spanking really is not a punisher. So we can only use those terms as identified by the effect that it has on the behavior. If it helps to stop the behavior, then we can call it a punishment or a punisher. The next level is level 3, the removal of desirable stimuli. So in my FBA, my building an FBA, building a BIP, we talked a little bit about cost response. So the response cost procedures are when reinforcers are removed in attempt to decrease behaviors. So when we're using response costs, what we're doing is we're withdrawing specific amounts of the reinforcements upon the presentation of undesired behavior. These can also be seen as leveling fines. So if we think about fines for our own behavior, if you are speeding or get a parking ticket, that's a fine paid for not following the rules. These are most commonly used in token economy systems where there is a response cost for exhibiting the inappropriate behavior. So, for example, just as a student can earn tokens for exhibiting the appropriate behavior, there may be some sort of response cost associated with showing the inappropriate behavior. You must consider the following cautions when you're using a response cost system. First, you must have the ability to withdraw the reinforcer. They talk about if you're using edibles, so if you're using goldfish crackers or marshmallow, something where the student can eat the reinforcement, obviously you're not going to be able to take that away from them. Once all reinforcers have been withdrawn, you have to be aware that the appropriate behavior will be harder to elicit. For example, if a student starts out with maybe 10 tokens at the beginning of the day, and every time they act inappropriately, you remove one of those tokens. If by the first hour they've lost all of their tokens, they kind of lose their motivation for the day, and that's when we can start to see some of those more inappropriate behaviors come out because they no longer have anything to work for. Before selecting a response cost system, there are questions on page 242 of your text that are important to follow. So make sure that you have more positive procedures, and make sure that different reinforcement strategies have been considered. So this is not the first thing you want to go to is a response cost. Make sure that you've tried the positive procedures as well. Does the student currently have or have access to a pool of reinforcers? So again, making sure that they have access to reinforcers. Have the rules of appropriate behavior and the results or fines for infractions been clearly explained and understood? So we have to make sure that the student knows exactly why they are getting those things taken away from them. Has the ratio of the size of the fine to each instance of misbehavior been thought out? So just kind of making sure that the punishment fits the crime. Can the reinforcers be retrieved? So the example that I gave, if a student has 10 tokens to start out at the beginning of the day and they lose them, is there an opportunity for them to regain them as well? If there's not, that's when you may see more of that inappropriate behavior show. However, if they have the opportunity to earn those back, it may be a more appropriate reinforcement. And will appropriate behavior be reinforced in conjunction with the use of response cost? So it's often best if we use both at the same time where they can earn and have them taken away as well. Level 3 is where we move to some of those low level punishing behaviors. They talk about timeout procedures. When we talk about timeout procedures, we're really just talking about timeout for positive reinforcement. So it's just a shortened way to say that they're not able to receive positive reinforcement at that time. A non-exclusion timeout is when a student is not removed from the instructional setting but denied access to the reinforcement. So this may look like head down on the desk, music is being turned off during free time. The author talks about a timeout ribbon. This is something that I had never considered before. I can't say personally that I love it, but that the student wears some sort of ribbon, badge, sticker to show that they're able to earn reinforcement. And when they have shown inappropriate behavior, that ribbon or badge or sticker gets taken away from them so that the teacher knows who is not able to earn reinforcement at that time. Again, not personally something I might try, but the contingent observation um, would be moving students to like the edge of the room or the edge of the activity so they can still observe appropriate behavior, but they're not allowed to participate. So that would be an example of a non-exclusion timeout. I know at school, we use something that's called a stop and think desk. So if a student is acting inappropriately, we may send them to stop and think. It's in the classroom, they can see and hear everything that's going on. And it's just kind of a quick timeout for them to think about their behavior and choose an appropriate behavior instead. And then when we as the teachers have some time to go over and address that, behavior and redirect them to the appropriate behavior, then they can return to the group. Then there are exclusion timeout procedures where we actually remove a student from an activity. Um, it's best if when a student has that they are required to perform a non-preferred task before returning. If a student's function of behavior is to escape and we give them an exclusion timeout or remove them from the activity, remove them from the room, remove them from their work, they will learn quickly to use that behavior to escape the non-preferred tasks. So we want to make sure that they know that there is a consequence for their actions and that they will have to do something before they return to a task. And we want to make sure that that's a non-preferred. We don't want to give them a timeout to go color if the student likes coloring, because that will just reinforce that inappropriate behavior. Seclusionary timeouts are much less popular. They have been misused over the years, kind of leave a bad taste in people's mouth. There's been a lot of negative publicity. You can Google seclusionary timeouts and find all sorts of lawsuits, all sorts of controversial information about what a seclusionary timeout actually looks like. Whether you use non-exclusion or exclusionary timeouts, neither one of these are effective if there aren't positive reinforcements available to them when they're showing the correct behavior. So if there's no payoff for them to do the right thing, chances are they're not going to care if you take them away from that. Also, level 3, that removal of desirable stimuli, that's where we identify with the term punishment. This will typically rapidly stop the occurrence of the behavior. It does have some long-term effects. I apologize if you heard my dog barking in the background. He's kind of a nut. So as I was saying, this rapidly stops the occurrence of behavior and does have some long-term effect. It also does help provide a clear discrimination between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and it illustrates to other students what the result will be if they engage in such behavior. However, it is not recommended in school, especially when physical contact is involved. We want to avoid putting hands on kids at all costs because it can just lead to bigger problems. Level 4 talks about the presentation of aversive stimuli. Here is my warning to this. This is technically a level, but this is not something that we want to use in school. This will lead to trouble if you use it in school. When we talk about presentation of aversive stimuli, we're talking about actions that result in physical pain or discomfort. The use of physical restraint does fall under this. Again, we just want to avoid putting our hands on kids at all cost. That would be a very, very, very last resort. And there are very strict regulations in school. In class, we'll talk about those rules and regulations. There is a ton of paperwork associated with that. And there are different procedural followings that you need to be aware of before the use of physical restraint. Conditioned aversive stimuli refers to stimuli that a person learns to experience as a result of pairing with an unconditioned aversive stimuli. So the most common forms of this are yelling or scolding. And again, we know that these are less effective ways of dealing with behavior. Disadvantages to aversive stimuli. Most of these are pretty obvious. But when we present a student with an aggressive punisher, students have 3 choices. They will either strike back, become withdrawn, or engage in escape type behaviors. We know that modeling is the most powerful tool for teaching, so be careful what you are teaching. If you're trying to teach a student to manage their behavior in a more calm and non-aggressive manner, screaming at the student is not going to model what you want them to do. The student may learn to fear the person if they do not understand the behavior that's being punished, and that's something that we never want our kids to feel. Some will also consider this punishment as reinforcing, therefore not making it a punishment at all. If a student likes to see their teacher get riled up and lose control, flip their lid, they may actually engage in this behavior in order to get you as the teacher going. I think about this like poking the bear. They may think it's fun to poke the bear to get you agitated and sit back and watch you get upset. So we have to make sure that when we're dealing out a punishment, that punishment is actually seen as a punishment and not reinforcing. The last thing we talk about is overcorrection. So overcorrection is actually a pretty common procedure that works fairly well. So there's two different types of overcorrection. There's restitutional overcorrection, where a student must restore or correct the environment that they disturbed beyond its original condition. For example, if a student throws trash on the floor, an example of restitutional overcorrection might be that instead of the student just picking up the trash they threw on the floor, they're going to go pick up all of the trash on the floor. Um, I know we have a student in fifth grade who tends to not use the bathroom correctly, and he will use the bathroom in the bathroom wherever he feels like. Instead of having him just clean up the mess he's made, we have had to have him clean the entire bathroom with the janitors several times. So that would be an example of restitutional overcorrection. Some other examples might be that if objects are disturbed in a classroom, let's say maybe they knock books off of a bookshelf, their job is to go around and straighten the entire classroom. If they have made threats to frighten someone or intentionally annoying one person, instead of just apologizing to that person, they may have to apologize to everyone in the room that was present. Or if there's a case of disturbance, maybe they were just disturbing class, a period of absolute silence may be enforced to overcorrect that behavior. The second kind of overcorrection is positive practice overcorrection. So this is just where the student must engage in practice of appropriate behavior to the point of overcorrection. So for example, lining up over and over again to make the student practice the correct sequence and behavior. We want to make sure that we avoid negative practicing. We don't want to practice the inappropriate behavior. Um, there is no pretense, there's no data, no indication that this works well. It does not work to teach appropriate behavior. So we want to make sure that when we are practicing overcorrection, when we're doing that positive practice, that we're only practicing the appropriate behavior. Okay, your assignments for the week. You will have case study assignment number 6, which is your BIP implementation plan part 2, due this Friday, November 13th by 11:59 p.m. You will need to prepare for your week 12 check for understanding quiz. Your reading for the week, chapters 11 and 12, they're not super long and we'll discuss those next week. Prepare for your week 13 in-class discussion for next Monday. And look over the case study assignment number 7 requirements so that you're familiar with the requirements there. Make sure to pay close attention to the rubric. I've noticed as we've gone through the case studies that sometimes I'm having to dock points because we're not including all of the requirements. So just make sure that the rubric is attached for each assignment. Make sure that you're taking the time to look over that and know exactly what you need to include in your case study for the week. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments about anything we've gone over tonight, make sure that you bring those up in class or shoot me an email, and I will see you in class.